We are very fortunate tonight, very fortunate. I think I'll let Elaine tell you how fortunate we are to have her here tonight. She got a better offer, but she decided this was a better offer. I'll let her tell you about that. But we're exceedingly grateful to have her here tonight. I'm going to read you her bio, which is also on the table. Elaine Weiss is an award-winning journalist and writer. Her magazine feature writing has been recognized with prizes from the Society of Professional Journalists, and her byline has appeared in The Atlantic, Harper's, New York Times, Boston Globe, Philadelphia Inquirer, as well as reports and documentaries for National Public Radio and Voice of America. She has been a frequent correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor. Her long-form writing garnered a Pouchard Prize, Editor's Choice Award, and she is a proud McDowell Colony Fellow. Her first book, Fruits of Victory, The Women's Land Army in the Great War, was excerpted in Smithsonian Magazine, online, and featured on C-SPAN and public radio stations nationwide. Just this month, she was awarded American Bar Association's Silver Gavel Award, which recognizes a published work that has been exemplary in helping to foster the American public's understanding of law and the legal system. Elaine holds a graduate degree from Medill School of Journalism of Northwestern University. She has worked as a Washington correspondent, congressional aide and speechwriter, magazine editor, and university journalism instructor. Elaine lives in Baltimore, Maryland with her husband, Julian Krolik, when she's not traveling, right? A lot of that lately. Her husband is a professor of astrophysics at Johns Hopkins University. They have 2 grown children. When not working at her desk or traveling, she can be found paddling her kayak on the Chesapeake Bay, and she votes in every election. Was it 5 days ago now? That there's going to be a movie made of her most recent publication, The Woman's Hour. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I want to make sure everybody can hear. Is this loud enough? Yeah? Okay, great. I am delighted to be here, even though I had to decline an invitation from Speaker Nancy Pelosi to be at the Capitol last night to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the House of Representatives passing the 19th Amendment. Finally. But I said, no, I'm going to be in South Spain. I can't come. Anyway, she'll have to understand. But you may see that there has been news coverage of that, and there were some wonderful pictures of congresswomen wearing white and wearing yellow roses in commemoration. So I'm so pleased to be here with you tonight because you are celebrating a 100th anniversary too, which is the 100th anniversary of the Michigan League of Women Voters. And I was delighted to be with the State League Convention a few days ago, and I come before you as a proud member of the Baltimore City League of Women Voters. And yes, we are a small and mighty group. And I am a Michigander by marriage. My husband is from Michigan, and I learned when doing research for this that in fact several of his grandmothers and great-grandmothers were suffragists. So we are part of this history, and I'm sure many of you are part of this history, and I urge you to actually look into it because I think you'll find some wonderful moments in your family that connects to this extraordinarily important moment in our national history. So when my husband's ancestors, women ancestors, were marching in suffrage parades in 1912 and 1913 here in Michigan. And here is a picture of a Detroit suffrage parade going down Gratiot Avenue. And yeah, and it's a great thing to do because advocating for women's rights was really quite dangerous at this time. It was looked down upon, it was condemned, and it was highly controversial. Of course, women's rights and voting rights are still controversial today, I hate to say, but this is the group that's going to help change that. I've had the pleasure of spending the last 6 years in the company of your foremothers, the suffragists. These were the women and men, they always had many male champions who won the vote for you and for me. And I can tell you from my research that they were very special. They came from towns and cities across the nation. I know that there was a very, very strong Michigan suffrage movement, and we're going to see some photos of them soon. But they were, as a whole, across the nation, considered pretty outrageous. And here's some pictures of the suffragists. This one in 1913 in Washington at a suffrage parade. They were audacious. They were outspoken. They were ingenious. Here's another one. They were disruptive and considered so. They were brave, and they were considered very dangerous. And here is the Brooklyn Women's Suffrage Association taking aim. Can everyone see that picture? And those same women, those same outrageous, brave, audacious women, after 7 decades of ceaseless work to win the vote, then had the foresight and the courage to found the League of Women Voters. These are the same women. The League is the daughter of the suffrage movement. And 99 years ago, in February of 1920, Carrie Chapman Catt, your founder of the League, stood at the podium of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, your predecessor, and proclaimed the birth of the League of Women Voters. A mighty political experiment is what it was called. Now, Michigan was actually a step ahead, and because Michigan women had won the vote in November of 1918 by a referendum, and we'll be getting into that soon, they actually formed the League of Women Voters of Michigan in April of 1919. So you are celebrating your 100th anniversary before anyone else. You are in the forefront of all the celebrations. And this mighty experiment was the next big step, the next natural chapter, the most perfect continuation of the suffrage movement. And it was the fulfillment of Carrie Catt's great dream of democracy. And to some, it was a really crazy idea. And it was denounced as a crazy idea at the time. It was not accepted. But a century later, I think you've proven, the leagues all over the country have proven, that it was really a brilliant and an important idea. And that night in Chicago, Carrie Catt and her colleagues, who formed the League, looked out into the future. They had to take a step. They had to be visionary. And the future they envisioned was everyone here sitting here tonight working on issues at the local, state, and national level. So the book I've written about the suffrage movement, The Woman's Hour, is a great, rollicking, bare-knuckled political tale. But the difference from most bare-knuckle political rollicking tales is it has women as the lead protagonists, the lead political actors, not just helpmates, not just historical footnotes, but actually the prime movers, the prime political activists in this tale. So it's a book about democracy and our ambivalence about democracy. It's about political power and political will. It's about racial and gender politics. It's about states' rights. It's about the vote. And it's actually the creation story of the League of Women Voters. So it is in its essence the story of how American women's demand for the vote, which was once considered radical, crazy, subversive, impossible, was slowly and methodically and at great cost transformed into constitutional law. So it's the story of the 19th Amendment, the largest expansion of the franchise in our nation's history, giving the vote to half of the citizens of the nation who were not included when the Founding Fathers established a government by the people, well, at least by some people. So in essence, the book is about how change can be made in society and in democracy. Because the 19th Amendment wasn't just a legal change, it wasn't just a constitutional change, it didn't just double the American electorate, it didn't just make women full political citizens for the first time, it really marked a societal change, a cultural shift about the role of women in society. And that's what made it so difficult and so complicated and so controversial. The fight for women's suffrage is really one of the pivotal civil rights campaigns in our nation's history. And it cuts to the heart of what does democracy mean? When we say, we the people, do we really mean everyone? And who gets to participate? Who has a voice? And of course, you know, as members of the League, that we are still asking that question today in our nation. And Michigan plays a distinctive, if somewhat conflicted, role in this whole drama. And here's a suffrage parade in Grand Rapids, Michigan, during one of the suffrage referendum campaigns, and there were several held here in Michigan, when the question of whether women should be entitled to the most sacred right of a democracy, the vote, was put to the voters. But of course, the voters were only men. Only men could vote to decide whether women deserved the vote. And I hate to tell you, but in this instance, the answer was no. But that answer gradually changed. And that's really the story in the book. It's how that changed, both in Michigan and in the nation. Now, I wrote this book because I didn't know how it was that I, as an American woman who does vote in every election and has taught my children to do so, how it was that I had the vote. I knew that at some point in our history, we'd been left out. And I knew at another point, we had it. And what happened in between? And I looked at some history books, and most of them said things like, there would be a sentence, maybe a paragraph, and they often would say things like, in 1848, women met at the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, and then fast forward, and there were picket signs, and then in 1920, they were given the vote. Just like that. American men saw the light. It was the March of Progress, it just happened naturally. No, that's not how it happened. It required 3 generations of fearless activists working over 72 years in 900 state, local, and national campaigns to secure the vote for American women. And the culmination of that whole crusade comes down to one fierce 6-week battle in Nashville, Tennessee in the summer of 1920. Now, by the summer of 1920, the suffragists had been fighting for the vote for over 7 decades. And here's another, that's the Grand Rapids. And one last state was needed to ratify the 19th Amendment. Now, as we said before, Congress passed it, the House passed it on May 21st of 1919. The Senate, we're about to celebrate that in a few weeks, on June 4th. And then it went out to the states. And it had been circulating around the states for the past year. And Michigan, will tell you, was the 3rd state to ratify. It was actually tied for first place. So you are going to be able to celebrate the centennial of Michigan. Today we did the ratification of the ERA, go back a few years, and June 10th is the ratification centennial of Michigan ratifying the 19th Amendment. You should be very proud of that, because as you'll see, it was not that easy in most states. So by the summer of 1920, 35 states had ratified. They just needed one more. And it turns out that Tennessee could be that last final state. And here's this editorial cartoon showing Uncle Sam furiously trying to button up that last 36th button. If the Tennessee legislature approved the suffrage amendment, it would become the law of the land, and every woman in every state, in every election, would be entitled to the vote for the first time. If the amendment failed in Tennessee, the suffragists were very nervous that it might be delayed indefinitely and perhaps never enacted. And those of us who are still fighting for the ERA, which was introduced into Congress in 1923, 96 years ago, know that that can happen. That an amendment can come very close to ratification and not make it over the threshold. And they were very worried about that, because 1920, they could see the nation was swinging in a more reactionary phase. And the 1920s actually were very politically conservative. We think of the flappers, but politically it wasn't like that. And they really feared if they didn't get it now, with the presidential election coming in the fall, they were not going to get it for the foreseeable future. And they were right about that worry. The enfranchisement of half of the citizens of the nation was at stake, and it all came down to Tennessee. So by 1920, the suffragists had been fighting for 72 years, since that first outrageous demand for the vote was made by Elizabeth Cady Stanton at Seneca Falls. And I have to tell you that most of the participants at Seneca Falls actually thought it was a terrible idea. It was much too radical. It was much too out there. And they begged her to withdraw that resolution. It was called Resolution Number 9. And they said, don't do it. You'll make us seem ridiculous if you ask for the vote. And it was a young man who was in the audience. He'd driven his buggy 50 miles from his home in Rochester to attend the meeting. And he stood up and he defended Elizabeth Stanton's call for the vote. And it was 30-year-old Frederick Douglass who stood up and said, no, you must demand the vote. You know that it will not be given to you and it will not be given to me without a demand. And he persuaded the other very reluctant participants in the Seneca Falls meeting to support Stanton's call for the vote. And Frederick Douglass called himself a woman's rights man for the rest of his life, and he truly, truly was. He believed and he worked for universal suffrage. And he is truly a hero of the book. And you'll find him there in a role that I think you've not thought about him being so much a part of this part of the history. Now, in the years since Seneca Falls, tens of thousands of dedicated suffragists of all ages had waged over 900 campaigns at all levels. And they traveled hundreds of thousands of miles to do, as Susan Anthony described it, organize, educate, and agitate. So it's like what you do in tiny towns and big cities across the nation. And we see them go from horse and buggies to cars in the span of the movement, because they had to change hearts and minds before they could change the law. And that's something you understand, that you have to prepare the ground for policy changes, especially ones as momentous as this. And that's what they were doing. And here's a special suffrage travel poster for Detroit and Michigan. This shows two noted suffragists traveled 10,000 miles in a Saxton Roadster. And this was to prove, this trip was to prove that women could drive cars and could maintain them on the road, and were fit to not only take care of their cars, but to vote. They were strong enough to vote. And so this was a great publicity stunt. So it was really a great, stupendous feat of organization, because these women did not have the kind of transportation or communication tools that we just take for granted. You know, we mimeograph, we print this out, we have the phones. Well, there was, when the movement begins in the middle of the 19th century, passenger train travel is new. There's no transcontinental railroad. The telegraph has just been invented. There's no telephone, there's no internet, certainly. There's not even a typewriter at the beginning. So you can see that they have to do it by hand, by foot, by word of mouth. And as one young woman in my publishing house said, she read the manuscript in its early stage, and she went into my editor and she said, I don't understand how these women did it without Facebook. But they did. They held meetings, and they held rallies, and they marched, which was not considered proper for women to do. They didn't wear pink pussy hats, but they did wear their marching uniforms, white dresses with yellow sashes. And here's some wonderful photos of women marching. 40,000 women marching in New York City. Here's another. But it was never easy to be a suffragist. It wasn't like today where we could say, okay, I think I'll go to that women's march. You had to face the derision of your community very often. They faced contempt and ridicule in their communities, in their churches, in their clubs, in their families, and in the press. And here's some very strong images that we're going to see of the anti-suffrage point of view. What I would do with the suffragists. And you see, it's torture. Again, keeping her quiet. A suffragist was too outspoken for most of society at the time. Here's another one, Peace at Last. It's really hard to look at these. They were derided as, they were pelted with rotten eggs and spoiled vegetables. And Susan Anthony actually used to say that she could mark the progress of the movement by the projectiles that were thrown at her. When the eggs just were plain old eggs and now rotten eggs, well, that was progress. When they were just regular tomatoes and now rotten tomatoes, she was really pleased. They were attacked by mobs of angry men and boys in the street. They were thrown down, their banners ripped, their clothes torn asunder. They were denounced as radicals, as you see here, perverts, traitors, anarchists, bad wives and mothers, of course, even Bolsheviks and socialists. We're hearing that lately too. So here again, a stark choice. Are you going to be in the home or the street corner for a woman? You can be either a loving mother or an activist, a crazed activist on the street. They were derided as unattractive, unsexed she-men. And the men who supported them, and there were many men who supported them, were belittled as Mabels and Nancys. It was all about the threat to men. So here you go, election day, mom is gonna sail off to go to vote, leaving dad with screaming babies. This becomes a very popular motif, dad having the screaming babies. So here we go, here's one. Here's another, When Women Vote. And she is smoking cigars and reading the sporting news, and he is having to hold the screaming babies and make his own clothes out of her old skirts. This is the kind of threat to the home. They're considered, they're portrayed as unattractive. Why would an attractive woman need the vote? She should have a man who will vote for her. Guess which one is supposed to be the suffragist? And they weren't subtle with their fears. This is what they feared. Who's going to wear the pants? What will men wear when women wear pants? Of course, that's a whole other issue about whether they wear bloomers or pants. And then my favorite, bed of trouble. And this one's pretty self-evident. Clearly, they were frightening. They were frightening. In their quest for equal citizenship, the women of the suffrage movement employed a wide variety of strategies and methods. And many of these, marches, as we saw, demonstrations, picketing, acts of civil disobedience, which we'll see soon, sophisticated lobbying and public relations operations, and taking legal test cases and bringing them up to the Supreme Court, would later be adopted by civil rights campaigns later in the 20th century and even into the 21st. They were pioneered by the suffrage movement. The suffragists were ingenious and fearless to test the prohibitions in state laws against women voting. Susan B. Anthony, Sojourner Truth, who was living in Battle Creek, Michigan at this time in 1872, actually voted in the presidential election. Sojourner Truth went to her polling place in Battle Creek and she was turned away. Susan Anthony actually was allowed to place her ballot in the box. She was soon arrested, placed on trial, and convicted of illegal voting in a federal election. And here is a magazine cover that is titled "The Woman Who Dared." And here she is wearing, appropriating Uncle Sam's hat, and she has her ever-present threatening umbrella. She's always portrayed with a threatening umbrella. She went around New York State giving more than 75 lectures as she was awaiting her sentencing. And the title of her speech was, "Is it a crime for a US citizen to vote?" And of course, we're asking that question again right now. Failure of this voting experiment encouraged Elizabeth Stanton and Susan Anthony to draft a constitutional amendment which would supersede all the state laws that prohibited women from voting. It was introduced into Congress in 1878, and it stalled there for 40 years. It was voted down 28 times. Meanwhile, the SUF had to work in the states because states actually, as you know, control election law. And so they would try to get the state law changed, waiting to be able to do it on a national level. They had to get enough states to agree to this to put pressure on Congress. Michigan had a long and somewhat frustrating history when it came to women's rights. Here's an early picture of Michigan Grange, which always supported women's suffrage. The Grange was an early and constant supporter of women's suffrage. And in fact, in 1846, so now this is 2 years before Seneca Falls, a feminist named Ernestine Rose here in Michigan spoke to the Michigan legislature about the need for women's suffrage. She wasn't taken too seriously, but she did make that very famous speech. In 1849, again, just a year after Seneca Falls, a Senate committee in Lansing proposed a universal suffrage amendment. This was really controversial because universal suffrage would also mean black men and women could vote. So this is really very progressive, but it was not acted upon because of what was called the needlessness of a franchise for women. It was just dismissed. In 1866, here's some more pictures of advocating for the vote in Michigan. In 1866, the state's first bill on women's suffrage to advance in the legislature was defeated, but just by one vote. So 1866, it got close when nothing was happening in the other states. So it's really interesting to see how progressive you were on this. In 1870, a bill giving women the vote made it all the way to the governor's desk, but he vetoed it. Suffragists tried again in 1874, and this time the bill died in the legislature. And here is Clara Barton's enrolled suffragist card. You could be a card carrying suffragist. And here's her membership card. Women tried to convince the 1908 State Constitutional Convention to include an amendment granting women the vote, but that didn't go anywhere. And then in 1912 and in 1913, votes for women was on the state ballot, but men voters deciding to vote it down. And here again, this is in Battle Creek, and it's a 4th of July parade, and there's a float for the suffragists. Again, they got their word out in lots of innovative ways. So here is a pamphlet from the Michigan Equal Suffrage Association, and it's saying why Michigan lost the Equal Suffrage Amendment in 1912. And basically the reason was corporate money. Dark money, mostly from the liquor industry, which was big in Michigan and in many other states, and they fought very hard to keep women away from voting. Finally, in November of 1918, just before the armistice, ending World War I, so here is a sample ballot. And those of you who work in the legal will find this interesting. So this is a sample ballot that was given out to teach men how they can vote for it. And on this sample ballot, it's very helpfully marked with no. on women's suffrage. And here, so this is again appealing to men. And so they have a group of soldiers about to deploy to Europe, saying real soldiers who stand for real democracy over here and are ready to fight for world democracy over there. These banners were carried in Grand Rapids, and one of them says, "Let our mothers vote." So they pulled the heartstrings. I mean, they were using everything they could. And finally, the men of Michigan said yes. And they were able to win that vote. And the Michigan Equal Franchise League transformed itself overnight into the Michigan League of Women Voters. And that's how it happened across the nation. The suffrage leagues became league chapters just as soon as women in that state got the vote. Finally, in June of 1919, what we're celebrating in the next couple of weeks, the federal amendment was passed by both houses of Congress, sent to the states for ratification. And Michigan was the third to ratify the same day as Illinois and Wisconsin, but they got that paperwork into Washington first. So you lost out a little bit, but both chambers of the legislature ratified unanimously. Can you imagine that happening today? And you should be very proud, because it's not that easy, as you'll see. But even before Congress passed the amendment in June 1919, Carrie Chapman Cash, your founder, was always a master strategist, and she was planning her next campaign and that next cause, and that was the League of Women Voters. The League was her great dream for American democracy, but she wasn't just a dreamer. Carrie Capp was never just a dreamer. She was a dreamer with a detailed 25-point plan, and a blueprint and a timetable. She'd been developing the idea of the League for decades. It wasn't just like an inspiration that came to her one day. She was an Iowa farm girl who at age 13, and I describe this in the book, first felt the sting of women's disenfranchisement when she realizes her mother cannot vote. And she was just stunned by this realization. And she vowed to change the law, to dedicate her life to changing the law. She began her career as a school teacher, and she was fundamentally always a teacher, and that comes out in the League. When she entered the suffrage movement, she translated her teaching and administrative talents into organizing expertise, and she became a demon organizer. She became a protege of Susan B. Anthony, one of what was called Aunt Susan's Girls, a coterie of young women around Susan Anthony, who she very carefully groomed for leadership. She took them out onto the road. In fact, Carrie Catt traveled with her extensively throughout the nation. And she groomed them for the next generation of leadership. They often had to speak together on the same podium. They had to sleep together in the same bed when they couldn't afford 2 beds in a rooming house. And Carrie used to say that it was okay because Aunt Susan was very thin. But traveling around the country, Carrie Catt noticed that women didn't know how to do what you just did before my talk, run a meeting. They had never been asked or allowed to run a meeting, so they didn't know parliamentary procedure, they didn't know Robert's Rules of Orders, they did not know how a bill becomes a law, they didn't know the fundamentals of how does government work. And she was really disturbed by this. And so she developed, as early as 1895, a political science course to teach suffrage organizers the ropes of civic engagement. She taught them how to run a meeting and how government works and how a bill passes through the different chambers. When in 1915 she led the campaign for a suffrage amendment in New York State, which is where she lived, she began what she called suffrage schools. And these were classroom sessions to train organizers how to canvass and how to poll and how to campaign. So again, this is like the basic, teaching women how to enter the political world. And these suffrage schools spread around the country. And they were held all over, and I'm sure there were many in Michigan. Around 1917, she enhanced these and began citizenship schools. These were pop-up universities where she would bring in distinguished professors of political science and also suffrage campaign veterans to teach women how to run a campaign. But they also teach the fundamentals of American history and American democracy, so you would understand what you were fighting for. Out of this, she developed a comprehensive civics curriculum. Mrs. Catt's citizenship course, it was called, in 26 installments, and it was syndicated in newspapers around the country. As I was doing my research and looking at newspapers from Tennessee to California, you'd see a whole page, and it would say, Mrs. Catt Citizenship Course, and you would subscribe to this course, and you would learn and take tests and get a certificate. The lessons were collected in book form, and it was a bestseller. So you can see she was test driving the concept of the League for years before. And looking ahead to when women would, hopefully, finally get the vote, and 27 million women would be eligible for the vote when the 19th Amendment passed in 1920, Catt envisioned a strong women's lobby to press for legislation benefiting women and families. And she hoped that this women's lobby would work at both the state and the national level. And here you see an early plank of the League of Women Voters at the Democratic Convention, I believe it was 1924. And they are, again, they have planks. They are part of the process. But before this could be achieved, women need to learn how to use the vote. And not just the women of the suffrage movement, but all women. They needed to be educated in the way American government worked and on the issues, which of course you're still doing. But so did millions of men, especially immigrant men, who had come to these shores and did not know the fundamentals of how government worked. And so the League was always intended to educate not just the suffrage women, but all women, and men too. So instead of fearing these immigrants, or shunning them, or turning them away from our shores, or maneuvering to keep them away from the ballot box, which unfortunately is the way we seem to be handling the situation right now, Carrie Catt proposed a real solution. Provide immigrants and new women voters, and all Americans, with the education to become knowledgeable, active, engaged citizens. Teach them how to make democracy work. So Kat introduced her idea of the League at the 1919 convention in St. Louis. She set up study groups, does that sound familiar? To evaluate the feasibility of, and work out the logistics. How is this going to work? How are we going to organize this all over the country? And also study groups to research pressing public issues and recommend action by the League. It's a perfect blueprint for what you're still doing. She provided the model for how the League should work and still does. By the 1920 suffrage convention, Kat was ready to announce its birth. "Women, be glad today," she called from the podium. "We should be glad and grateful and proud. Ours has been a movement with a soul, a dauntless, unconquerable soul, ever leading on." And here is the first board of the National League for Women Voters. But even from its birth, from the very beginning, the League was controversial. It was to be political, but nonpartisan. A tricky balance, as you well know, and I was reading some of the requirements in the program here, and that's still a tricky balance. It was to be a women's political organization, but outside of the political parties. Also tricky, as you know. And it was not to have League women run for office, which in hindsight may or may not have been a good thing, because it did make some of the most experienced suffrage women stay out of electoral office. But even though these are tricky balances then and now, I think you have proven that this idealistic blueprint can work. So Carrie Kat never shied from these controversies. She never shied from any controversy. She urged the newborn League to be bold, and she told them, the danger is that the League is going to be too timid and too conservative. If the League hasn't the vision to see what is coming and what ought to come, and be 5 years ahead of the political parties, I don't think it's worth having. Never forget that first, you are an American, and secondly, that you stand for a radicalism of a constructing and building nature. I think that's a very good description of what the League tries to do. So 6 months after this official launch of the League, in the summer of 1920, the 19th Amendment was finally on the cusp of victory, or maybe defeat, because everyone knew that Tennessee was a very dangerous place to have to stage this last definitive battle for the vote. Nearly all the other southern states had already rejected the 19th Amendment, including the state where I live in Maryland, and all for the same blatantly racist reason: they did not want black women to vote. So the suffragists knew that they faced a very uphill battle in Tennessee, but they had no choice. It was their last best hope. So all the forces for and against women's suffrage gathered in Nashville, and it got wild. More than 1,000 men and women poured into the city to enter the fray. Carrie Kat comes down from headquarters in New York and spends 6 grueling weeks in Nashville, leading her suffrage forces into battle, and this is what she looked like in 1920. When I began my research, I went to Nashville in mid-August because I wanted to feel the heat. Because it's almost a character in the book, everyone talks about the heat. Carrie Kat complains about the heat. And it was sort of method acting for historians. You know, I wanted to feel it and understand it, and realize that the women were wearing 10 pounds of clothes. You know, they weren't wearing little tank tops. They are wearing, they're not wearing hoop skirts anymore, but pretty heavy long skirts and long sleeves still. And there's no air conditioning. And they're having to sit in the top of the gallery where there's no air. So I wanted to feel that, to understand it. There were, what Carrie Kat faced there, were very powerful forces opposed to women's suffrage. And these were political, corporate, and ideological foes, each with their own reason for opposing women getting the ballot. politicians who feared this unpredictable new voting bloc, these 27 million women, and no one knew how they were going to vote. Some of the politicians also feared whether they were handsome enough to appeal to men for the first time, to appeal to women for the first time. And so they actually worried about whether this was a good idea for them personally. Clergymen, there were many clergymen who supported suffrage, but many more who did not. And they argued that it's against God's plan for women to vote, because she had obviously made Adam to be dominant over Eve, and for her to question this in any way went against biblical teachings, and they used the Bible to fight against women's suffrage, and you see that happen a lot in the book. Corporations, many corporations fought against women's suffrage, believing it would be bad for the bottom line. For instance, the textile manufacturers, very prominent in the southern states, were fearful that if women could vote, if mothers could vote, they might want to abolish child labor. And they depended on child labor because it was cheap. So they were fighting tooth and nail to keep women away from the ballot box. The liquor industry, again, women had been very much associated with the temperance movement. And in the summer of 1920, prohibition is in effect. It's there. 18th Amendment has been ratified. But they're hoping that if they keep women away, maybe it won't be enforced very stringently. That if they can keep women from selecting their legislators and their congressmen, that it'll be kind of wink and a nod in terms of enforcement. And so they're trying to keep women away. And one of the comical strains in the book is the liquor industry in Tennessee, which is very strong, actually sponsors a speakeasy. Remember, prohibition is in effect. A speakeasy on the 8th floor of the Hermitage Hotel, where everybody is staying. It's called the Jack Daniels Suite for Tennessee's favorite liquor. And they ply legislators 24/7 with free liquor and arguments on why they should kill ratification. And there are scenes of these legislators bouncing off the walls and singing at the top of their lungs, and they have to be thrown into the showers before they can go into the chamber to vote. But the most passionate foes of the 19th Amendment turned out to be women. That women might oppose their sisters getting the vote, might not support policy in their best interests, was shocking to me. At least it was then when I was writing the book in 2014 and 15. And some of these anti-suffragists were really very sophisticated, educated women. In fact, some of them were like the famous muckraking journalist Ida Tarbell, who had single-handedly brought down John D. Rockefeller and the oil trust with her articles from McClure's magazine. She believed, she was one of the most powerful journalists in the world, and she was on the board of the Anti-Suffrage Association. It's hard to figure out. And then there's one that's a wonderful, strange mystery, and it brings gasps from my audience, so I'll just prepare you. Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, she's not an anti-suffragist, she's not, but she never supports the movement. And in fact, when New York women do win the vote in 1917, she's eligible to vote in 1918, she refuses to vote. She is so ambivalent about it that the anti-suffragists try to court her. And her husband is running for the vice presidency in 1920. And he has declared that he supports women's suffrage. So what you will see is her evolution on this. She comes around very quickly after ratification, and she joins the League of Women Voters. And she becomes a protege of Carrie Catt, who sees her potential and immediately makes her a director of legislative affairs or something like that. And that begins Eleanor Roosevelt's political climb. Political interest. It's in the League. You are the place that she cut her political teeth. But I think that many of the women who opposed suffrage were social and cultural and religious conservatives who truly fear that this was going to bring about a profound and unhealthy altering of gender roles. It was going to endanger the American home. They said men and women will divorce because they'll argue about politics. And it would, what they called, bring about the moral collapse of the nation. It would alter private life as well as public life. And that's what made it so frightening. And one of my favorite anti-suffrage broadsides is called America When Feminized. And it has a hen and the rooster, and the hen is wearing her Votes for Women sash. And the rooster, she's just walked off the nest, and the rooster calls after her, "Ma, the eggs are gonna get cold." And she calls back, "Sit on them yourself, old man. My country calls me." And one of the many taglines there is, "A vote for the federal suffrage amendment is a vote for organized female nagging forever." Yes, I think a bumper sticker, don't you? So I think this is an important reminder that the fight over women's suffrage was never just a political fight. It was also a cultural and a social, and for some, a moral fight over women's role in society. And it really is a precursor to what we would call the culture wars today. Something that in its many levels of emotion and passion, it becomes much more difficult to have a conversation about. So, all sides confront one another in Nashville, and it gets wild. There's bribes and booze and propaganda and blackmail, conspiracies and fistfights and kidnappings. The newspapers call it suffrage Armageddon. And the outcome truly remains in doubt until the very last moment. And I'm not going to spoil it for you, but it does come down to a single vote of conscience from the youngest member of the Tennessee legislature, who receives a letter from his mother. It was very close. It almost didn't happen. Now, all this took place almost a century ago, almost precisely. But I think you'll find that this is a history book with surprising and even unnerving modern themes. It helps explain where we've been, but also in many ways where we are. It deals with topics that are in our headlines and in our thoughts right now. Voting rights and voter suppression, women's rights, inequality, dark money in politics, the role of religion in public policy, and racism. Because the story of women's suffrage is inevitably a story about race. It comes out of the abolition movement, as you'll learn. And in Nashville, there are cries of white supremacy and states' rights. The Ku Klux Klan is invoked as a dog whistle, and the Confederate flag is flown in defiance. Here's a picture of the opening of the anti-suffrage, Women Anti-Suffrage Association in the Hermitage Hotel. That's the leader, Josephine Pearson, on the right, and Nina Pinkard on the left with the stars and bars, with the oldest Confederate veteran they could find. And this is filled with all kinds of symbols, which I describe in the book, racist symbols that Tennesseans would understand. And this was their publicity photo, the opening of the headquarters. And we've certainly been seeing echoes of all of this recently too. I finished this book on, I handed in the manuscript on the day before the 2016 election. That was the deadline. I mean, it was the first week in November. And I pushed the send button, which is how you send these things now. It's just electronic, and it flew through the ether to my editor, and she wrote back, "Great timing." Well, we I thought it was great timing. But in fact, what has happened in the 2 and something years since is that this book that I wrote about activists taking to the streets and demanding change has taken on a resonance and layers of meaning I could not have anticipated. I think that it teaches us some important lessons, that social change is slow and political change is hard, and persistence is the key. These women were knocked down and betrayed and defeated time and time again, and they stood back up and they fought the next battle until they won. It teaches us that the struggle to expand our democracy is ongoing. It was not completed in 1920 by any means. We know that Black women and men would be denied the vote, not because of the 15th or the 19th Amendment. That says all women in every election, in every state, but the way it was subverted by Jim Crow laws. And they would have to wait until the Voting Rights Act of the 1960s, which of course has been threatened again, and we have to fight that battle still. Native American men and women were not granted the vote until the later in the 1920s, but was not recognized in the states, in some cases until the 1950s. And Asian men and women were not allowed to be citizens or to vote, even if they were native born, until after World War II. So our sense of being a democracy is one that we really have to ask questions about and keep asking questions about. And it also teaches us, I think, that reform movements are imperfect and we shouldn't expect them to be perfect. The story of women's suffrage is very inspiring, I think so, but it's also a cautionary tale. There are moral compromises made to reach success, and we should learn from them, and we should study them and see if we can do better. I hope the story that I tell in this book will teach a new generation that voting is important and that making positive change takes patience and persistence. The suffragists did not stop in 1920. Carrie Catt, as we know, founds the League of Women Voters and is honorary president for the rest of her life. Alice Paul, leader of a other wing of the suffrage movement, who you will meet, drafts the Equal Rights Amendment. So it comes directly out. It's introduced into Congress just 3 years later in 1923. And as we know, it's not ratified yet, so we have our work cut out for us. But I hope that this lesson to a new generation, to our generation understanding what our history has been, but to a new generation to teach them that protest is patriotic, but it must be continued and followed up by well-designed and sustained political action. The suffragists didn't just march and picket and protest, they also lobbied and campaigned and drafted legislation. And they did not rest after the 19th Amendment was secured, as we know. And they continued in the League of Women Voters. The vote is a prayer, as Carrie Catt described it. The vote is power. And today, we must protect the vote for all citizens. That is our job. And it's our sacred duty to use that vote to improve our democracy and make democracy work. Thank you very much. Oh, say a few words about Warren Harding. Oh, yes. So one of the characters in the book is Warren G. Harding, who is running for the presidency. He is the Republican candidate. And I write about his campaign and the suffragists' interaction with it, because it's very important that they win his support in order to get this ratified. And what I didn't realize when I was writing this, again in 2015, I've made out too many checks, 1917, 1918, they get bounced, really. But what I didn't realize, because I wrote this before the election, and before certain things were revealed, that this had a resonance that, again, I didn't recognize at the time, because Warren Harding, during the 1920 election, is being blackmailed by one of his mistresses. And he's just paid hush money to keep her quiet and actually send her out of the country. And his campaign slogan is "America First." And it was just something that I didn't realize until months later, you know, that, oh my, wow. So that's the story of Warren Harding. And I should also say, it was alluded in the introduction that it's going to be a TV series, and that is the plan. And the way it happened is actually, for me, the more important and meaningful part of the story, which is soon after the book came out, about just a few weeks, I received a note, a call from my agent saying, "Sit down." And it seems that one of my readers was Hillary Rodham Clinton. And she had read the book and was very surprised. She didn't know a lot of this history. She's a League member, I believe, but didn't know anything. And she said, "This is an important story. We need to know this story. This really tells us, grounds us in our history, and a lot of it is still going on. And would you partner with me to bring this to as large an audience as we can?" And I said, "Okay." Sure. And so we have, and she brought the idea to her friend Steven Spielberg, who said, "This is a great idea." And so we are working with his production company, which is called Amblin. And she is the executive producer and very involved in all aspects of it. And we are developing this. It's a kind of slow process. I've never worked in Hollywood before. But it's, again, to bring this so a large audience. I hope every person in America reads the book, but that's not going to happen. So this will, again, get a large audience understanding this history. It's not a documentary, it'll actually be a drama. So that's the story of its next chapter. And it's very exciting to me, of course, to be working with her and to see how much she believes in this story and how important she thinks it is. Thank you very much. And congratulations.